Welcome back to another episode. Today, I want to delve into why you need to progressively load range of movement in order to improve and maintain your current level of mobility. Now, as a physio, this is something that pops up all the time. People get really good results from training. They get really good results from treatment, and the two work together really well. But what ends up happening is they develop these tight spots over time, and these spots become a point of pain. Now, in my world, I can very easily help release these spots with some dry needling or some treatment or some loaded stretching. But often we don't look to progress these exercises all that well. So what ends up happening is the exercises that we have in there become redundant. So as we progress through our training journey and we get better over time and we get exposure to different ranges of movement, we also want to make sure that we have the strategies and the exercises in place to help you moving long term. Now, the week just been, I have had a heap of clients who specifically needed a little bit more range through the hips and the pelvis. And these are great lifters. They're great athletes. They're moving really, really well. They just needed a bit more. So this is what this episode is all about. I want to give you a practical way that you can implement some exercises that will help take your current mobility routine further. Now, what that's going to do for you, yes, I still advise go and get treatment, have those regular checkups, make sure that your body's moving well. But what it's going to give you is something tangible, something that you can use and actually delve into in your training. So today I'm going to specifically speak and focus on the actual lower body and the pelvis itself. But we can also, if there is enough interest for it, I can do one for the upper body and then give you guys something that you can actually take and use. And then give me some feedback and open up some good questions. So let's dive into it. Now, I think the first thing to have a look at is why we get tightness in general. Like, what is it? Where does it come from? And how to identify it? Now, where I would start out is there are multiple reasons why you can get tightness. So the first one is just postural adaptations. If we're sitting down for a long period of time, or if we're doing repetitive tasks at work, say you're on the tools, you're a tradie, whatever it may be, when we spend time in these positions over time, what happens is our bone structures deform, they take shape, and then our muscles tighten up to hold the bones in place. It's just basic understanding of how the body works. So if you're exposed to certain positions over time, the muscles will just adapt. They will get tight because they're just trying to do their job. They're a messenger. They're trying to control a joint. They're trying to control range of movement, and they're trying to keep you safe. So if we put something in a sustained position for a period of time, the muscles will just adapt around it. So that's one of the big considerations. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. It's just something to think about. The second is training. Training can actually be really not that functional for you. Training, we're doing the same movements over and over and over again. So if we're training for something that's like a sport focus or a specific outcome focus, what that means is we're having to get really good at certain things, which means we may do repetitive movements time and time again. Again, it's not necessarily bad, but these tension spots and these positions that we get ourselves into over time can actually become problematic for you. So I'll use a very simple example that I always seem to use, but if I was to do 1,000 hip flexions, bring my knee towards my chest, over time, that muscle group's going to get really, really tight. Now, that's not necessarily bad because it's actually doing a job for me. It's doing something for me. But we also need to think about it. Think about your car, for instance. If you drive it a lot, you're going to have to get it serviced. You're going to need new brake pads. You're going to need to change the oil. This is the same concept here. If you use, say, your hip flexor in this example, over and over and over again, we're going to have to do something about it. So this is where the mobility side comes into it. Then the other big category or group is you actually do have a weak spot. So let's use someone that's hypermobile, for instance. Say someone can't actually maintain a neutral stacked position when they're deadlifting or doing clean pulls or some sort of hinging variation. They're going to default to an extension-based position, which means that their lower back's going to get super jacked up, the front of the hips are going to get super jacked up, and over time, when you're doing these exercises, this is actually where your body gets stability from. It's where it gets control from. So it's doing a really good job. But what that leads to is muscle imbalance. So then the other opposing muscle groups or the other muscle groups in that system become downregulated. So that is another huge reason, because your body goes, well, I feel safe. I feel secure. I know that I can do the job here. That is why I'm going to use these muscle groups. So that is basically where I would fall into the big three categories. Something to note on this is with training technique as well, you can never be in a perfect position all the time. That's not the goal. The goal is to not be fragile. But over time, when we do train, we're going to fall out of position, or we may not be in the optimal position as we're learning a skill. So we might also build and develop some tightness through this as well. But I think if we look at like muscle tension as a whole, it's not necessarily always bad. In a lot of cases, it's either just the demands that we've placed on our body, so it's responding to it, or there is some movement-based issues that we sort of need to deal with from training. Now, because we're talking about the active lifter and lifters in general, I want to keep this really specific for you. When we're training, there are actually a few other factors at play here. So I think a really big one to consider is your body type and your body makeup. Depending on the proportions of your limbs and your torso specifically, it means that when you're lifting, it's going to place stress on different areas. So let's use an example of a squat here. So if we had someone who has a really, really short torso, but really long legs, the strategy for them to squat is actually with a really decent amount of knee over toe and a decent amount of hip back. So going both ways. It's not a really hingy squat and it's not a really knee dominant squat. It's a really nice balanced squat. What that allows for them to do is be super nice and upright. Now, in a situation where this particular lifter was trying to, instance, sit back into low bar squat, really sit back, what that would do is it would tip their torso forward. So over time, they would actually start to develop a lot of tension through the lower back, a lot of tension through the pelvis, through the glutes, through the hamstrings, because they're forcing these positions that they're not necessarily bad, but there is a trade-off for that position. So over time, these lifters with different levers are actually going to start to bias different muscle groups. So we could go on with like bench press, squatting, a ton of different variants. But I think it's just important to note that when we are working with lifters, we all have biases. We all have strength spots. Like think of someone that you know that you go, wow, that person just has an amazing bench press, for instance, but they're terrible at squatting and deadlifting. There's probably a reason for that. You know, a big part of it is probably how they're made up in terms of their levers or personal preference. But in saying that, they're also then going to develop tightness and specific strategies to get good at certain tasks. And then if you're not good at, say, squatting and deadlifting, for instance, in that example, you may actually then build up specific tightness in areas just to try and stabilize and control these movements. When we look at training as a whole as well, we're pushing to a point where we're quite fatigued. So we might get to a heavy set and say we're doing a set of 10. We might get 2 reps away from failure. In those moments there, it's often the point at which we fall out of position or we lose our position or our technique and things start to break down. I always say like we go to the path of least resistance, where that is a position that your body is comfortable in and we'll generally gravitate to it. So if we use a squat, for instance, say I was doing a really like extended set of squats, which I don't do all that often, but say I was doing a set of 10 or 12 reps and say I had a really strong glute and hamstring complex. When I was getting out of the squats, I would generally then kick back to my hips and turn into a bit more of a like good morning squat, purely because I'm looking for strength and stability. And if I have a strong posterior chain, my body's going to naturally gravitate to it. So when we are training, we also then need to recognize that we all have these positions and postures that we'll sort of default to. And sometimes it's unrealistic to think that we can break the pattern because our levers and our make is in a certain way. So what that's going to lead to is even more tension in these spots, because someone that trains hard for an extended period of time, you're going to default to these positions over and over and over again. So, training isn't bad, but, like I said earlier on, it is a stimulus that we need to actually manage. And this is where I want to lead into the next part is mobility and movement strategies that are also progressive, that works alongside your training is so important for you to keep making progress in the gym. So I really just want to iterate that is, like stretching is great, mobility mobility is great, but it has to be progressive in nature to align with your actual training in itself. The people that I treated, this week gone, and, we added in some really cool drills, and they're not crazy complex or anything like that. They're just taking the stretches and the movement that you would normally do to a bigger level. So the next section, we're going to dive into a specific breakout of the lower body. And I'm going to show some video examples on the screen so you can actually use them and play around with them and then get back to me. Now, if we look at the lower body, there's really 4 big areas. Now, there is biases within that to certain areas, but I'm going to say the hip flexors and the quads, the adductors, the glutes, and the posterior chain. Now, that's looking at the big muscle groups. In the active population, the front of the hips and the lateral chain of the hips just gets so tight in a lot of lifters. It's an area that just does so much work for us. So let's give a very practical way that you can have a look at this. At the front of the hips here, we've got 2 big ways that we can actually stretch the hips. So we can stretch the actual quad itself where we bring in the rec fem. It crosses the hip and the knee. So stretches such as, it will be on screen, the couch stretch. So there are variants of this that we can do. So without a band or with a band, it doesn't really matter, but the ethos of lengthening the front of the quad is really, really important, because if we have length in that means that we're going to be able to get into squatting positions better, and we're going to be able to get into hinging positions. Now, this is a great drill, and this may be perfect for where you're at, but over time, we are also then going to need to stretch this. Now, we can do an elevated split squat style stretch that's loaded. And I'm going to show you on the screen. So basically, we're putting ourselves in an elevated position and then going into the bottom of a split squat. Now, if we do that with weight, we're getting exposure to the very bottom of that position, which means it's going to stretch out the rec fem and the front of that quad a lot. And the thing is, we can then progressively overload it with weight as well. Then the next progression on top of that is actually looking at something like a front foot elevated split squat. So instead of now just being in the static bottom position, we're actually starting to take this through range with load as part of your training program. This is something that you can progress with over time. Now, that is a very, very logical way to do it. You open up space with a couch stretch, then you go into something that's loaded, not necessarily going through range, but exposure to end range with weight, and then taking it through a range of movement. Then if we move into the back of the hip, like the glutes, what we need to do is exercises and think about things such as a pigeon stretch. Now, I really like the incline bench variation of the pigeon stretch. This drill in itself is super comfortable. You can twist your torso onto yourself and hinge over yourself in a way that you really kind of focus on getting into the hinge. It's not too hardcore that you are stressed and you can't focus on the nuances of the pelvis, the nuances of the position. And it's really good because you can, even if you are a bigger, person in terms of muscle mass, or you do have some tightness, it's really comfortable on the outside of the knee. It's a real common complaint in pigeon stretch with people who are working on mobility, is that pain on the outside of the knee. So starting off on this incline bench, pigeon stretch can be a really, really, really good start point. But over time, we're also we're going to want to progress that as well. So there's a really easy variation that we can do that adds a kettlebell into it. So now we're actually starting to get a loaded movement. So we can actually then focus on actively controlling our hinge over the top of our leg and progress the weight over time. Now, there are other variations which take it a step further, but I would just say for now, that is probably all you need. And if you do need more, reach out, because there's a heap of further progress drills that we can do on top of that. But from the glute side of things, that is a really logical way to actually look at things. Now, moving into the adductors. Now, this area is, in the industry right now, I think it's not trained that well. There are groups of people who are training it really, really well, and then there's others that's not. There's a really big craze on hip internal rotation at the moment. So I'm seeing so many people come into the clinic with rock solid adductors. Like, they do not move. When something is that stiff and immobile and rigid, that's an injury waiting to happen. That's what fragile is. So with the adductors itself, you want to be able to actually take your body into positions which stretch it under load. Now, I love drills such as the adductor rock because what that does is it allows you to play around with a square pelvis position with the leg away from the midline. You can really get some good length through the inside of the leg, and you can just create a bit of length through that inside. And it's comfortable. You can get a good stretch, but it's not too hardcore. Now, once you actually are good at getting some range and things have loosened up a little bit, you want to start to progress that. Now, Cossack squat is probably the logical, but I think it's too far for a lot of people. I think people just miss the adductor completely in most cases with the Cossack. So what I'm going to suggest is actually a moving adductor plank. And I actually like to set this up on an incline bench because it increases the range. And what this allows is you can start to get that length on the inside of the actual adductor itself. Stress it out. It's just your body weight. And then you can lift your pelvis up to the roof. Amazing for not only getting mobility, but strengthening up the adductor. If you were to open up some range of movement with the actual adductor rocks and then move into this adductor plank on an elevation, I call them moving adductor planks, absolutely amazing because you open the range and then you strengthen it through range, which is the whole point of this. Now, the hamstrings is probably the last big muscle group that we're going to go through, but the hamstrings in itself are a tricky one. Don't get me wrong, hamstrings do get really, really worked. They get really, really tight. But I would say they're on the lower end of my priorities list with a lot of people because a lot of people come in with more tension in the front, which often shows up tightness in the hamstrings. So I normally address these areas first if there's any issues, and often that clears up a lot of the hamstring tension. But in saying that, if you are someone that does have hamstring tightness or posterior chain tightness, this will actually be epic for you as well. Now, the banded hamstring stretch. This is gnarly. It really is actually quite a challenging stretch. Now, what I would say is start with your hand on like a yoga block and then work your way down to the ground. And you want to keep the weight into that hip itself. You want to shift the weight into the hip so that you're getting that really nice stretch through the back of the hamstring. You can play around with positions. You can bend and straighten out your knee. You can shift the weight across into that side of the hip. And what you'll find is it's pretty intense the first time around. So say you held that for 60 seconds or 2 minutes. Then say you went to the opposite side and did the same. It would still be equally as intense. But then you come back to the first side and do another round. That side there actually becomes really, really a lot more pleasant. It's still tough, but it's a lot more pleasant. The sensitivity seems to drop off it every single time you do it. Now, you're going to want to take that a step further. Now, there's a drill here that I think is really, really good because it starts to expose you to active control in hip hinging. So I call it a standing hip flex. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but I often make up names for these exercises just because there is an array of them. But basically what you're doing is focusing on driving the hip back in a standing position on a single leg, and then you're hinging down forward, flexing your torso forward. So you're getting some active length actually through the hamstring itself. Now, this drill here, I would actually just take it as far as you can go whilst maintaining a really good hinge and just hold it for 5 to 10 seconds. And that I would do anywhere from 5 to 10 reps. Now, if you do it, it's actually really, really challenging. But what you'll notice is over time, you'll get a lot more active control into torso flexion. So your hamstrings get comfortable being lengthened under load with your body weight, and you get better at maintaining that hip hinge. So it's a really, really good combination there. Open up the length through the hamstring, get it desensitized, and then actually start to use it without load. Now, when we look at global, body movements, so we've got one more big category. So global flexion and global extension. There's probably not that many people that can do a full body bridge. Like there is, don't get me wrong, but for the majority of active lifters, it could be a goal to work towards. I don't often progress this as something that is a metric of success, but I may come full circle on that and start to work on that at some point. But what I like to do if we're looking at the lower body is reverse Nordics and Jefferson curls. Now, both of these drills require a little bit of progression. The Jefferson curl is a fantastic exercise because it's intentionally designed to take us through what is not good technique. So we practice actually getting like flexion and loaded movement through our spine, which is actually something that could be quite good if you think about it, because we get kicked out of positions when we're training. We're not always going to lift with perfect technique. So having exposure to different ranges that isn't perfect is actually something that's going to help you, because it's inevitable. When you train hard, you're going to get thrown out of position. But you as a lifter just want to have enough resilience and not be fragile enough, so fragile that you break, right? So exercises like this can be great because you can learn to hinge under load with a flex back. Now, this definitely isn't the start point for a lot of people. But then if we have a look at the front side, I say this to a lot of people, is we often don't really think about the front side. You know, we do our hip flexion stretches, you know, we stretch our quad, all that sort of jazz, but there's a big global movement, and that's the reverse Nordic. It's a fantastic drill. And where most people will be starting with it is actually with a band assisted variation. But as you get better at it, when you're leaning back and you're keeping those glutes engaged, if you can get your torso all the way down towards the ground or close to, you can actually start to load it up with a little bit of weight. And I think the most logical thing is just holding a med ball or a dead ball or something that you can kind of squeeze, because then it keeps a little bit of that anterior core activation through your midsection. And as you're leaning back into it, it keeps you aligned, like your pelvis and your ribs are communicating. So then you're actually starting to get the stretch in the right places. Now, that is like such a progression for the entirety of the lower body, front, back, side to side. And they're really good exercises because it exposes you to length and then it actually takes you through loaded range of movement. So your body can actually get used to it and then start to get used to using it under load, which is perfect. Now, another drill that I think should just be in everyone's lower body warm up is a hip 90-90 rotation. Now, everyone's probably seen these, but I like to use them more so as an assessment to see what it is that I actually need to do in my training session. So if I'm transitioning my leg across and hinging across the leg that's on the ground, I can instantly get feedback of where I'm tight. If I'm feeling tension in the back of the leg, I go, okay, cool. I'm probably going to need to lean into a little bit more of the pigeon-based stretches for the glute. But if my inside of my leg is screaming and super, super tight, I'm then going to go, okay, well, I'm probably going to lean into a little bit more of the adductor rock progression. That's where I'm going to sort of open things up. And on the trailing leg on the back, if you're really tight through the front of the hip, one, you're going to struggle to really get that hip moving forward and rotating. So you're going to struggle to get the extension on the back leg. So then you might be like, that's me. That's a nutshell. So then you would actually go into more of a couch stretch hip flexion strategy rather than just doing everything. So I use it to assess the hips, and then I go and actually do some mobility based off that, which is a super simple way to look at this. So really, really practical way. Hopefully these videos have actually provided some value. And I would say get up and actually have this on pause and just run through the exercises, but do the 90-90 first, and then go and run through some of these exercises and come back and retest it on the 90-90 and see how it feels. You'll often feel that it changes the movement completely. And then if you get up and add to that a squat beforehand and a squat after, you'll often feel that you just feel a lot more open. There's less resistance actually getting into these positions. Now, to wrap things up, you are only going to be able to stabilize and control positions that you've trained. Initially, we often have a lot more range of movement, or we have a lot less resistance because our body's not stiff. So as we stiffen up, as we get tighter over time, naturally we need to work on actual range of movement. Now, you know, I've made a lot of posts about this over the last few weeks, but you know, you get groups of people who are really anti everything to do with movement. And look, I'm telling you right now, I've worked, like some of the people that I've worked with for over 10 years. And the first 1, 2, 3 years of their training looks very different to what it looks like at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. It's a very different strategy because you're almost like running with this honeymoon period at the start. You're just winning, you're stacking up strength, you're building muscle mass, your body feels amazing, but there will be a point in time where that stiffness and that tension needs to be addressed. Obviously, ideally, the sooner the better, but often we wait for something to happen before we actually implement it. Because once we get down to the pointy end and we can actually work at really good intensity, our numbers have gone up, our muscle mass has grown, the limiting factor actually won't be your ability to work. It will be your ability to get into position and lift pain-free. So this is where movement-based strategies come into it. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping people, because in a lot of cases, people get sidelined or they can't work at the intensities that they want to purely because of pain or movement limitations. And that sucks. That is a terrible reason to not train. We should, like, training is the thing we need. We need to be in the gym, but we need to be doing it in a way that allows for long-term progression. So my suggestion for you is go through all those exercises, test before with a squat or a hinge, whatever movement you're doing, do some 90-90s, run through the drills, and then retest. And I can guarantee you're going to feel instantly like you have more access to range of movement, and then go and warm up. I guarantee you have a cracking session. So that's it for me today. If you want to follow along with my latest podcast episodes and my YouTube videos, in the description below, I have a link to my newsletter. Every week, I'll be getting it to your inbox. No junk mail, only good information that you can implement into your rehab and your training. See you guys on the next episode.